"Get out of my house, dirty poor people." That's what my mother-in-law screamed at my parents the night they came to meet her. Before she even sat down, she didn't know the truth. She didn't know the poor people she insulted were billionaires. And the house she lived in wasn't even hers. If you've ever been judged for how you look, talk, or where you come from, stay with me. This story will make you believe that respect costs. Nothing but arrogance can cost everything. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories where karma arrives, dressed as truth. When I first met him, I wasn't looking for love. I was focused on building my career, learning how to stand on my own feet, and protecting the quiet peace my parents had worked so hard to give me. But he had this calm confidence about him, the kind that made everyone around him listen when he spoke. He wasn't loud, just sure of himself, like the world had always bent in his favor. We met at a business seminar through mutual friends, and somehow one conversation turned into dinner, and dinner turned into late night calls that stretched into mornings. He told me he admired my simplicity, that I was refreshing in a world obsessed with appearances. Then I thought that was love speaking. Now I know it was foreshadowing. I grew up in a home filled with warmth, not wealth. My parents taught me that humility was the richest thing a person could wear. They didn't flaunt what they had. And though most people thought we lived a modest life, the truth was my parents owned one of the biggest investment firms in the country, built their empire quietly, never chasing attention or praise. Let your success speak for itself, my father always said. So when I fell in love with a man whose family lived for status, it didn't occur to me that humility might one day be mistaken for poverty. When I met his mother for the first time, I could feel her eyes measuring everything about me, the dress I wore, the way I spoke, even how I held my fork. She was the kind of woman who believed that money defined people, that pedigree mattered more than kindness. Still, I smiled and did my best to win her approval. My husband, to his credit, tried to bridge the gap between us. He told me she just needs time. Once she sees who you are, she'll love you. I wanted to believe that, so I waited. Our relationship moved quickly. Within a year, we were married, surrounded by lights and laughter that felt more like a show than a celebration. I remember my mother-in-law's cold smile as she hugged me for the photographs. It never reached her eyes, but I brushed it off. I thought I could change her perception. With patience, with love, I told myself she'd eventually see the person I really was. I didn't realize that people, blinded by pride, rarely see anyone but themselves. Looking back now, I can see the small moments, the polite jabs at family dinners, the backhanded compliments, the way she introduced me as the girl my son fell for instead of his wife. Each one was a warning, a spark waiting for the right moment to ignite, and that moment came sooner than I expected. I didn't know it yet, but the woman who once smiled through her teeth at our wedding would soon look me in the eye and say something that would change everything I thought I knew about family, love, and respect. It started with an invitation that felt more like a test than a gesture of kindness. My mother-in-law called one evening, her tone unusually sweet, saying she wanted to finally get to know my parents better. She said it in that rehearsed way people do when they're pretending to be gracious. I wanted to believe her that maybe after months of cold smiles and stiff conversations, she was finally ready to see beyond her assumptions. My parents, ever the kind souls, accepted without hesitation. It's important to keep peace, my mother said, her voice gentle as always, even with those who make it hard. The night of the dinner, I remember feeling anxious. adjusting the same necklace my mother gave me years ago. When my parents arrived, they looked simple but elegant. My father in his old navy blazer and my mother in her soft peach dress. They brought her a homemade fruit tart, the kind she used to bake for every celebration in our family. My mother-in-law took one look at the dessert, her lips curling into a faint, polite smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Oh, how quaint," she murmured, before turning her attention to the expensive bottle of wine she had chosen herself. Dinner was uncomfortable from the start. Every question she asked was a disguised insult. Where they worked, what car they drove, how often they traveled. My parents answered with quiet grace, never once taking the bait, but I could feel the tension in the air, her words like needles wrapped in silk. When my mother laughed softly at something my father said, my mother-in-law's expression hardened. She leaned back and said, "It's sweet how simple people can find joy in the little things." The table went silent. My heart pounded in my chest, but before I could speak, my father gently reached for my mother's hand. Then it happened. She stood, her voice sharp and filled with contempt. "You know what? I can't do this charade. Get out of my house, dirty poor people." The words sliced through the room like glass. My breath caught the air thick with shock. My mother's eyes glistened, but she didn't say a word. My father stood calm and composed and said quietly, "We were raised to walk away from disrespect, not to argue with it." They left, dignity intact, leaving behind silence so heavy it felt suffocating. And as that door closed behind them, I knew something had changed forever. Not just in how I saw her, but in how I saw love, pride, and myself. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the empty doorway, replaying every word she had said. Dirty poor people. The words echoed like a curse, twisting in my mind until they didn't even sound real anymore. My husband tried to comfort me, pacing the room in frustration. "I'll talk to her," he kept saying. She went too far, but I could tell by the way his voice trembled that he didn't know how to stand up to her. His mother ruled her home like a queen, and even her son bowed when she spoke. The next morning, my parents called me. I expected anger, maybe even tears, but instead they sounded calm. My father said softly, "Don't let her steal your peace, sweetheart. Some people need to be blinded by their own arrogance before they can see." My mother added, "We're fine, my love. Let life speak for us." Their voices carried no bitterness, only grace, the kind that doesn't need revenge to feel whole. Cried after that call, not because I was broken, but because I realized what real strength looked like. Days passed, but the wound stayed open. My mother-in-law went about her life as if nothing happened. In her social circles, she was the image of sophistication, hosting luncheons, attending charity events, and pretending to be the perfect matriarch. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate. Her friends had seen the tension that night. They knew, and soon the story spread through her circles about how she'd thrown out her daughter-in-law's poor parents. Each retelling painted her colder, smaller, uglier. My husband's face grew weary. He apologized over and over, but I couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore. Something inside me had shifted. A quiet, steady storm, building strength in silence. I stopped visiting her house. I stopped explaining myself, and for the first time, I stopped trying to be accepted. Then one morning, life delivered its first whisper of poetic justice. My father called again, his voice warm with restrained amusement. "You might want to tell your mother-in-law," he said lightly, "that The property management company she's in dealing with now belongs to us. I froze, heart racing. My parents had just acquired the firm that managed her estate, the very one she bragged about owning outright. I smiled for the first time in weeks, not out of spite, but because life had started writing its own quiet revenge. A few weeks later, my mother-in-law decided to host a grand family gathering, a celebration of her birthday, but also, I suspected, a performance to reassert her image. The invitations were written in gold foil, the kind that screamed luxury. Everyone who mattered to her was going to be there. Business partners, social friends, distant relatives who only showed up when there were cameras. When my husband asked if I wanted to go, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to stay home to avoid seeing that same cold smile again. But my parents, ever composed, encouraged me. Truth doesn't need to hide. My father said, let her have her evening. Ours will come naturally. The night of the event, the mansion shimmered under chandeliers and crystal wine glasses. Laughter and pretension filled the room like perfume. Pleasant but suffocating. When my husband and I walked in, a few heads turned, some whispered, some smiled too. Wide, my mother-in-law approached me with that same distant politeness, greeting me as if nothing had ever happened. I hope there won't be any awkwardness tonight, she murmured, almost as if she were doing me a favor. I simply smiled and said, of course not. She didn't know that beneath my calm expression, fate had already taken its seat at the table. Halfway through dinner, the conversation turned to real estate, her favorite topic. She boasted about her estate's new management team, praising how efficiently they had handled her accounts. Finally, she said, laughing lightly, a company that knows how to serve people of my standard. I exchanged a quiet glance with my husband, who looked puzzled, unaware of what was coming. Then came the announcement. One of her guests, a close family friend, proudly mentioned the recent acquisition of that very estate management firm by a group called Horizon Holdings. They've been buying up major portfolios lately. He said the new owners are brilliant, the Thompsons, I believe. The room went still. My husband's fork stopped midair. My mother-in-law blinked rapidly as if the name had punched the air from her lungs. My parents, the dirty poor people she had once thrown out, were the new owners of the company managing her mansion. Silence that followed was priceless. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I just sat there, letting the truth settle in the same room where arrogance once sat so comfortably. The look on her face said it all. Pride had finally met its mirror. The days after that dinner felt strangely quiet, like the air after a weather storm. My mother-in-law didn't call, didn't visit, didn't even try to pretend that nothing had happened. Her silence said everything. Word of the dinner had spread quickly among her circle. People whispered about how the poor family she had humiliated turned out to be billionaires who now controlled the very company managing her estate. Overnight, her perfect reputation, the one she had polished for decades, began to crack. The same people who used to praise her elegance now laughed behind her back. And for once, I didn't feel angry or vindictive. I just felt free. My husband confronted her a few days later. I wasn't there, but he told me how it went, how she tried to defend herself, saying she didn't mean it that way, that people say things they don't mean when they're emotional, but he didn't buy it. He told her that what she said that night didn't come from emotion. It came from arrogance. He told her that love can't survive in a house where pride sleeps in every room. When he came home that evening, he hugged me quietly and said, "You were right about her all along. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was sadness. Because pride doesn't just hurt the people it targets, it eats the person who carries it. A week later, she hosted a smaller luncheon, a desperate attempt to repair her image. My parents were invited this time, though none of we expected them to go, but they did. My father walked in with quiet confidence. My mother with her usual grace. People whispered, cameras clicked, and when my mother-in-law stood to give a speech, her voice trembled. I owe an apology, she said, her eyes darting to my parents. To the family I wronged, I was foolish and cruel. My father smiled faintly and said, we all make mistakes. The lesson is not in what we lose, but in what we learn. The room erupted in a light applause, but I could tell for her it wasn't applause she heard. It was the sound of her own pride collapsing. That night, as we left, she touched my arm and whispered, I hope one day you can forgive me. I looked her in the eyes and said, forgiveness isn't for you, it's for me, and I meant every word. A few days later, I got a call I didn't expect. It was her. Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, sounded small, almost childlike. Can I come see you? She asked softly. Part of me hesitated, memories flashing back of that night. Those words, that look of disgust in her eyes, but something inside me, maybe the part my mother raised, told me to say yes. When she arrived, she didn't look like the woman who once lorded over everyone. Her makeup was lighter, her posture smaller, and her eyes were swollen from crying. She sat on the couch, fidgeting with her hands, unable to meet my gaze. I've been replaying that night, she finally said. I don't know what came over me. Maybe I do. I was scared my son would end up like me. I frowned, confused. She took a deep breath and continued. I wasn't born rich. I grew up poor. I used to scrub floors for people who treated me like I wasn't human. I swore to myself I'd never go back to that life. And somewhere along the way, I became them, the ones who looked down on others. For the first time, I saw her as something other than cruel. I saw a woman who had spent her life chasing respect, not realizing she'd lost her humanity, trying to keep it. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. To your parents, to you, I can't take back what I said, but I want to make it right. I told her what my father once told me, that some lessons don't come to humiliate us, but to humble us. Parents don't hold grudges, I said softly. They only hope people learn from the pain they cause. She nodded, her tears spilling freely now. You're a better woman than I ever was, she said. I shook my head. No, just one who refused to let hate live rent-free. Later that week, she visited my parents' office. She apologized in person and, true to their nature, they forgave her. Not because she deserved it, but because peace is more powerful than revenge. Watching her embrace my mother, I realized healing doesn't always come with justice. Sometimes it comes with grace. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. Months passed and the bitterness that once filled our lives slowly faded into something gentler. My mother-in-law changed in ways I never imagined possible. The woman who once measured people by their status now made a habit of volunteering at shelters and attending community events quietly without cameras or grand gestures. She started spending more time with my parents, often showing up with flowers or baked goods just to talk. My mother would tease her gently, saying, you don't need to bring anything but kindness. And for the first time, I saw my mother-in-law blush, not from embarrassment, but from humility. Our relationship didn't become perfect overnight, but it became real. One afternoon, while having tea, she looked at me and said, I used to think respect was something you earned through power. But your parents, they showed me it's something you give through heart. That sentence stayed with me because I realized then true transformation isn't loud. It happens quietly when pride finally steps aside and lets wisdom speak. My husband and I built our own home soon after, not far from my parents' estate. It wasn't the mansion she once bragged about, but it was ours, filled with laughter, warmth, and peace. Sometimes on Sunday mornings, I'd catch her sitting with my parents on the porch, sipping tea and laughing over old memories. Watching them, I understood something beautiful. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It redefines it. I often think back to that night when she told my parents to get out of her house. It used to sting, but now it feels like a lifetime ago. A scene from a story with a better ending than anyone expected. My parents never needed to prove her wrong. They just kept being who they were, graceful, grounded, and strong, and life took care of the rest. If there's one thing I learned through it all, it's this. Respect doesn't come from money or titles. It comes from how you treat people when you think no one is watching. My parents taught me that silence can be powerful, dignity unshakable, and grace the ultimate. Revenge